Hey, and welcome to another Tech Tuesday. Today, we are at war. The war for who is going to be your next digital mixer. And today's battle is between the Behringer X32 or the Behringer Wing.
Hey, what do you say? Yes, it's that time again. It's Tech Tuesday.
So clearly there are more options available than just the Behringer X32 or Behringer Wing. But today we're focusing on these two because they are so popular in churches. The X32 has been around for many years now, and it's become a little bit of a classic. It's still being created today, but now there is the new Behringer flagship, which is the Wing, which has been out for a few years now. They just released a bunch of new models, and people are trying to decide, do they need a Wing or an X32? The cool thing is that both these boards are made by the same manufacturer, and you can kind of intermingle between the two of them. You don't have to necessarily pick a Wing right away. So we're going to talk about that today in the video and explain why one may be better than the other for your particular needs. So let's hop straight into it. Today we're going to be looking at 5 criteria. We're going to be looking at price, I/O, which is the inputs and the outputs on both consoles, DSP, which is the processing power of each console, ease of use for your volunteers, very important, and expandability for the future. All right, so the first one to be the most obvious is the price. The X32 has been around a lot longer. They still make it. The Wing is a newer model. It's bigger. It's got more price attached to it. Right now, this video is being filmed December 2024. They just recently released the newer models of the Wing. We're not going to talk about any of those today. We're going to talk about the full-size X32 and the full-size Wing. But both the Wing and the X32 recently went down in price. So this may not be exactly applicable when you're watching this in the future, but it'll give you an idea of what we're looking at. So if you were to go today and just go online and buy an X32, they are currently priced at $19.99. $2,000. The Wing is priced at $32.99. So there is a price difference of $1,300 between the Wing and the X32. Now, that being said, you can't necessarily compare console to console if you just put their prices on here without factoring in what you're going to connect these consoles to. Now, in both instances, I suggest that you get a digital snake to go with them, but with the Wing, you have to. With the X32, you should, but you don't have to right away. So if you're looking to go in stages, you could start with the analog snake that came with your analog board or smaller digital mixer, and you could utilize that with the X32 without having to buy anything else to start with. So if you look on here, on the back of the X32, you have 32 XLR inputs. I wonder why they call it the X32. You also have on top of the board a talkback input that is separate from those 32 channels. Whereas with the Wing, they are expecting you to purchase a digital snake right away. So the console only has 8 XLR inputs on the back of the board, and it does not have a dedicated input for talkback. So really, we're comparing 32 XLR inputs on the X32 versus effectively 7 on the Behringer Wing. So if you factor in the price for an S32, again, December 2024, that price for a 32 channel by 16 channel digital snake is $649. So if you factored in an X32 without a digital snake, priced against a Wing with a 32 channel digital snake, that puts you closer to $2,000 of a difference. That's $1,949 in today's prices, difference between the Wing and the X32. So on our comparison chart here, we are going to give a nifty little Ascension flame to the X32 when it comes to price. So with that price difference, $1,949 or what was it, $1,300, where is that difference coming from? Well, let's start by talking about our I/O, in particular our inputs. Now, Part of the reason why I'm making this video is because this can be a little bit confusing when you don't understand how the mix engines differ between these two consoles. So the X32 is on paper considered to be a 40 channel mixer. Well, why is it called X32? Well, that's because 32 of those channels are full processing. They give you all the works on there. And also 32 is basically your bottleneck when it comes to communicating through the card, doing recordings, that kind of thing. So 32 is your main number, but technically it's 40 because you do have 8 aux channels. So these have less processing. They're not as easily routable through the card and that kind of thing. Generally, they're going to be the 6 TRS inputs on the back of the console for ProPresenter, background music, that kind of thing. But that's also, those last 2 are going to be the USB connection on the top of the console, which in my opinion is basically useless. But it's there. You just can't change it to be anything else. And these are all mono channels, which we're going to talk about in a moment here. The Wing, again, on paper, is a 48 channel mixer, but those channels are stereo, which makes a big, important difference. So 40 to 48 doesn't sound like much, but the stereo functionality is where that's going to make a difference. 40 of those channels are full processing, like on the Wing, how you have 32. There are 8 aux channels that have less processing than the 40, but still more processing than the aux channels on the X32. And those are routable just like you can with the 40 main channels. So they just have one less insert point. They are missing the delay feature. And instead of having compression and gating separately, you can do a combined channel. So it's better than nothing, but it's not quite as powerful as the 40 main channels. And again, those are in stereo. So let me explain why this is important between these two consoles. My microphone right now, if it were plugged into a board, is a mono channel. So it takes one input and one channel. That's the same on both consoles. However, if I were to plug in something in stereo, say a keyboard is 2 inputs, left and right, and it's also on the X32, it's 2 channels, left and right, and you link those 2 together so that you can process them together as a pair. So on the Wing, the important difference is that the channel is inherently stereo. So that means that it's still 2 inputs, left and right, but it's only one channel. It's a stereo channel that listens to both those inputs and processes them together. The important thing to understand here, this is where the numbers get a little bit hairy. The more stereo things that you have with your Wing, the more powerful the Wing becomes compared to the X32. So the most extreme example would be, let's say that you had 48 stereo keyboards on stage and you plugged them all in, you had enough digital snakes to do that. In theory, you could have 48 stereo channels, so that's 96 inputs on the Wing. You would not be able to do 96 inputs on the X32. So practically, we're probably not going to have 48 stereo channels on stage, but what you might have for your church would be, say, drum overheads in stereo, guitars in stereo, maybe you have 2 guitarists, keyboards in stereo, maybe you have 2 keyboardists, some of your tracks in stereo, your room mics in stereo, your ProPresenter feed in stereo, your background music feed in stereo, and all these things add up if you have a lot of stereo channels. So I'll give you an example. We had a church that had all those things I just listed. They had 2 electrics, 2 keys, a bunch of tracks. We had 48 channels plugged in on stage. 32 of those were from a digital snake. The other 16 were a track rig. We had 8 wireless mics plugged in on the board itself. And then we had 2 stereo pairs for ProPresenter and background music. All in, if I remember correctly, ended up being something like 60 inputs across 43 channels. So that's where you're going to really get the benefit from the Wing when it comes to inputs, is if you have a lot of stereo things. Now, if you're in orchestral church and for the most part, everything you're doing is in mono, but you've got a lot of microphones for a flute and a trumpet and a sousaphone, so on and so forth, that's where you're not going to get as much of a benefit when it comes to inputs on the Wing because those aren't usually stereo channels. But in a typical band situation, you can plug in a lot more things on the Wing than you can on the X32. Next, looking at outputs. So again, on paper, this might be a little bit confusing. The X32 is a 25 bus mixer. And the way that breaks down is you have one main mix, which counts as two of those buses because it's left and right. You've got one mono mix for subs or effects or whatever you want to run on there, 6 mono matrices, and 16 mono mixes. These are both for in-ears, wedges, recording mixes, effects, all those things go across those. Versus the wing, again, on paper, this doesn't look like much of a difference. It's 28 buses, but those buses are all inherently stereo. So you have 4 main mixes, which is interesting. You have 8 matrices, again, those can be in stereo, and you have 16 mixes, just like you do on the X32, but again, they're in stereo. So what does this mean for you and your church? If your musicians want to have stereo in-ear mixes, which has become the thing the past few years, you are going to be able to handle way more stereo in-ear mixes with the wing than you can with the X32. With the X32, generally, my default scene, so this is the 16 mixes, but I'm using essentially 2 of them for effects and 2 of them for a live stream feed. So that gives me 12 mixes remaining. That means that with Ascension Collective on our X32 scene, when we have an X32 going, we can do up to 6 stereo in-ear mixes. If we are then going to have a guest musician or a camera feed that we need to plug in or something like that, that means that we have to either drop some of those people down to mono or to bring in another console for ears, and the complexity becomes a lot more. With the wing, the way our mix is set up, we have, let's see, I think I have, again, 12 mixes available, but that could be 12 different people in stereo. If you aren't using the way our template is set up on here, you could easily have as many as 16 stereo in-ear mixes. And then what's really cool is in the latest firmware updates, these 8 matrices, they can now be used as in-ear mixes as well. So you could easily have up to 24 stereo in-ear mixes with the wing versus, if you got rid of a bunch of things, up to 16 with the X32. And that would be 8 stereo mixes. So between 8 and 24, huge difference. In fact, if you're using the wing as a monitor console, you could really use all these buses and have up to 28 stereo in-ear mixes. It's wild. So that's where you're going to get a big, big difference. That's where that money is going from between the wing and the X32. So when it comes to our scorecard here, I'm going to give 2 flames to IO for the wing because it's giving you so much more in both inputs and outputs. It's a huge, huge difference between the 2 boards. Next, looking at the DSP, the processing, on the individual channels, the full processing channels. Again, there's 32 on the X32 and 40 on the wing. You have generally a high-pass filter, a gate, a 4-band EQ, compression, and a single insert on the X32. On the wing, you have both a high-pass and a low-pass filter built into every channel. You have a gate, you have a 6-band EQ rather than a 4-band, you have compression, and you have 2 inserts. One is before the fader and one is after the fader. The effects rack that they have on the console, on the X32, you have 8 rack effects. Now, a lot of these can be dual, but in general, you have 8 to work with. On the wing, you have 16. Now, because everything's inherently stereo, these 16 are already stereo. So it's not like how you get twice as many from the X32 is 16, but you're not going to need to use as many of these like you would on the X32, because one really cool thing on the wing is that you can actually per channel change out the gate, compression, and EQ on those 40 main channels. You can swap those in the channel without even having to go into your rack effects. And so you can use studio emulations of classic gear. There's some really cool things you can do. They're going to really take your processing power per channel much further than the X32 can do. For example, one really cool thing, this is built into the effects rack. This is something that up until recently, I've only ever seen on the Wing. A few other boards are doing it now, but they actually have a pitch correction plugin. It's not amazing, but it's better than nothing. And if your singer is close, it'll make her closer or make him closer. But that's built into the console, which is really cool. So there are way more options to get a really good sound on the Wing. And you can still get a good sound on the X32, but you have more ability to do so on the Wing. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to give one Ascension Flame to the X32 because at $2,000, you can still do amazing things with an X32 compared to some of the other mixers in that price point. So it's amazing, but I'm going to give 2 flames to the Wing because it really goes the next level, both in channel processing and in your effects rack. There are just so many things you can do to get a really solid sound with the Behringer Wing. All right, now let's, we're probably going to give a point to the X32 when it comes to user friendliness. Obviously, we are going to be having volunteers or paid staff, running these things, but we need them to be easy to use. And I would say that if you are just taking this console straight out of the box and plopping it down and plugging things in, and you didn't know anything about the 2 mixers, you just had to figure it out, you could get going a little bit quicker on the X32 than you could with the Wing. Because the Wing has so many powerful options on there, they have made their initial scene a little bit more complicated because they're kind of expecting you to customize it to your needs. So with that in mind, things like effects returns are easier on the X32 because they're already built in to that initial scene. You need to kind of take a little bit of time and set those up on a Wing. So I wouldn't, in a heated moment, wouldn't want to set up a Wing without some sort of template to build up with. That said, with either of these consoles, you will get better results if you hire someone to come out and help you with training and setup for your console. Now, that is something that we offer through Ascension, but we are based in Jacksonville, Florida. You might be in Brazil or India or who knows where. So it might not be financially viable for us to come out and help. I guarantee there's someone in your area that has one of these consoles. They might be more likely to be with an X32 just because it's been around longer, but hire someone to come out and help you to get this set up. If you don't have someone in your area, we have some free resources. Even if we can't come out to your church, we have a bunch of free resources on our YouTube channel. So we just released last week a free template with the Wing, and I have like a 20-minute video explaining how everything works in there. We got a whole bunch of videos for that. We've been doing years of videos with the X32. So at the end of this video, I will link to some other videos, some other resources that you can use to help you out with these consoles. But it's either one, you're going to do better with some training. But if you are very, very green to the digital workflow, an X32 would probably be easier for you to start with than a Wing. So again, we're going to give an Ascension Flame to the X32 for ease of use. Next, let's talk about compatibility and expandability. One cool thing about these boards, part of the reason why I chose these 2 boards for the shootout today, is that they both utilize AES-50. AES-50 is the way that we connect to digital snakes, to other consoles, to other gear that they offer in this ecosystem that Behringer has built up. The really cool thing about that is that because they both use AES-50, you can use the same gear with both boards, which we'll talk about in a moment. That makes expanding really easy on both boards. Next, both boards use Ultranet, which is used for like the personal monitors that they have. Now, the X32 has an Ultranet connection straight in the back of the board. The Wing does not, but if you connect to a digital snake, that's how you would connect that connection on there. But what the Wing has that the X32 does not is the Stage Connect option. Now, I haven't really used this yet, but it looks really cool. It looks like you can use a digital XLR, so like a DMX cable, to run to stage, and this gives you the ability to plug in extra modules with like line ins, line outs. Really cool for just expanding what you're going to plug in into these things without having to buy a full-on digital snake. So that does not exist for X32 as far as I'm aware, but it does work for the Wing. Both have USB card options on there, and these actually come built into the price for the mixer. So again, huge savings on both boards. Now, with that said, On the X32, it's an actual USB card, and it is limited to 32 channels. Now, that's a lot, but again, it's a 40-channel mixer, but only 32 channels can be used with this card. And if you want to switch out for another card option, like a Dante card, you can do so, but you're going to lose that USB connection. And again, you can only send 32 channels back and forth from Dante or whatever card you go with. On the Wing, you have a 48-channel USB connection, and it's not part of that card. It's separate, which is really cool because you can get different cards and still retain that USB connection, which is huge. It's a 48-channel USB connection. So in addition to that, you have the built-in card that comes with the Wing. You can replace this with some other cards, but honestly, I wouldn't. It's a 64-channel SD card recorder. So it's 2 SD cards. Each one can handle 32 channels in and out. And so it's amazing. You could do a full-on multi-track recording and playback from the console without having to have a computer involved at all. You can just plug in 2 SD cards, which is just crazy that you can do that. And it's so handy. I use it all the time for Ascension Collective. So I highly suggest that you utilize that 64-channel card. So when it comes to expandability, again, I'm going to give 1 flame to the X32 because it does have a lot of expandability options on it. And again, I'm going to give 2 to the Wing because it's just right out the gate, super expandable, and then you can switch up with some other gear later on. So one thing that I want to say with this, part of the reason why I chose these 2 mixers is that even though the Wing is in a lot of ways the more powerful option, because it's more involved, it's trickier with volunteers, it's more expensive, you might decide to start with an X32. And that's totally fine. And because of the way that this is set up, you don't have to make a complete full changeover if you in the future want to switch from an X32 to a Wing. You can easily start with an X32 and then build up in phases and then eventually replace it with a Wing. So for example, you could have a analog mixer with an analog snake, and then you could just decide that you're going to replace the analog mixer with a X32, but still use the existing analog snake. Remember, there are 32 XLR inputs on the back of that console, so you can do that. You don't have to start with a digital snake, but that's going to be your next phase, is to replace that analog snake with a digital snake like an S32 or 2 S16s or a DL32, whatever you want to use. But because that snake talks to the X32 through AES50, that means that your next phase is to just replace the X32 with a Wing, and you can keep the same digital snake that you've been using from phase 2, and now you've got the full system going on. You can then take that X32, it's still a very viable board. Maybe you just move it to the youth room, save it as a backup in case something happens, or you can sell it or donate it to another church. Why not? It's awesome. So with all that in mind, I would say that if you have the budget and volunteer base, with enough knowledge or access to someone like us to come help train you, the Wing is going to give you the most options, the newest thing straight away. And it's still incredibly affordable for what it is. But if you need to work your way into it a little bit more, make it a little bit more volunteer friendly, make it a little bit more budget friendly, the X32 is still a great option even in 2024, and it's very easy to upgrade over the next few years. So I hope that was helpful to someone out there. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Again, at the end of the video, there will be some links to some more resources for the Wing and the X32. Until next time, have a great week. Again, this is Chad from Ascension Worship. I hope this has been helpful for you and your team. Come back here every Tuesday for new information.